Hey guys, Brian from Better Chess Training, and in today's video we are going to be doing the first part of my introduction to strategy and positional play, and we are going to start with the topic of development. And the reason I chose this was when I look at the games of my students as well as my children, when they're playing each other, development is often neglected. It is also the first, I guess you could say, challenge. The first phase of the game in the opening is to develop your pieces effectively and efficiently. So we're going to be tackling that today, and I hope you enjoy. Okay, we are starting with development, and I thought the best way to do this for beginning and intermediate players, especially as more of a primer as opposed to a comprehensive treatment, is to give you some practical tips with examples. So we're going to start off with our first tip, which is to plan out your development. Consider how your pawn advances will affect your piece development. If you push one pawn, it might allow you to activate one of your bishops as opposed to another one. Similar, and I'll show that to you in a second. Similarly, if you push a pawn a certain way, it might block one of your pieces. So you really have to be careful there. Usually you're going to develop your knights first, unless you know in a specific opening that it's a another order. Okay, and then you're going to develop the minor pieces on the side that the king will castle generally. And I know there are some openings where you don't castle, but if you're a beginner or even an intermediate player, you're going to castle 95% of the time in your games, or at least you should. Okay, and then the other thing is just you don't want to move too many pawns early on unless it directly aids in your development or hinders your opponents, or in some other way advances the strategy of your game. Okay, so typically you're going to advance the central pawns first, and then develop your pieces, and then depending on how your opponent develops, you may use your other pawns strategically. Okay, so let's take a look at the board and go over this a little bit. Okay, so here's a few examples of planning out your development, and I'm just going to make a few moves here, and e4, e5, and here, as I mentioned, you want to develop your knights first. We want to see what our opponent's going to do in terms of his development before we decide what to do with our bishops. Okay, let's say our opponent plays into a normal type of Italian game. So when I say you want to consider you're planning out your development, you want to plan out how you're going to develop this bishop, and most often you're either going to develop to c4 or to b5. And the reason why that's important, because if you play a move like e3 to protect the e4 pawn, well, now your bishop can only go to e2, which isn't necessarily a bad place to go, but you want to have that in mind before you make your moves. Okay. Similarly, if you're not going to play this pawn up to d3, you could, for example, play bishop to c4 with the plan of playing d3 so you could develop your dark square bishop. But that brings up how you want to develop your dark square bishop. Do you want to play something like b3, which might be a little strange, in order to develop your bishop out this way? Okay. Problem there is that depending on what you do with this pawn, these dark squares can become very weak too. So the idea is that you want to have these things in mind as you're planning out your openings and as you're planning out your moves, because you don't want to just be in a reactive mode where you're just reacting to your opponent's moves. Okay, let's go a little bit further in just to flesh out some of these ideas. So let's go into an Italian game type opening. Now the next part here, we can castle here. A lot of times we don't, but we're just going to go ahead and castle. It's kind of a, I guess, in opening theory, it's considered a kind of conservative move. But here, I really think if you can learn to develop your pieces effectively, you'll be a big advantage over other beginners and intermediate players. Okay, let's say our opponent develops his knight here, And again, this is following that principle of developing the pieces on the side we're going to castle. So, of course, this pawn is being attacked. We can defend it in a few ways. And this is where, again, we want to plan out. So I can look at developing my knight here. But what I might want to do is just bring this pawn here now that this bishop is out of the way, with the idea that now this bishop can come out here. Okay, our opponent castles. And again, these are just examples. This is actually from a known opening, but you don't need to follow this exactly. Okay, here, white could even play something like this, bishop to e3, challenging the development of this bishop. So there's a lot of ways that this opening can go, but the idea here is you can see that we're not trying to checkmate our king right away. We're not trying to attack his pieces super aggressively. All we're trying to do here, we tucked our king away. We're trying to get our pieces out where they can be active and participate in some type of strategy in the coming moves. Let's move on to our next. Tip number 2 here is to study opening development. Okay, so when you play your games and you're looking up your openings, I want you to look at the typical piece development and the order of development. Okay, because opening theory is, there's a lot of good openings out there. There's a lot of different ways to play the opening that is correct and enjoyable. But you have to, at the beginning, you want to narrow what you play in the opening so that you can start to understand where the pieces go and why they go there. Okay? And this is where good opening books that explain the purposes behind the moves can be very helpful. Okay, in this next section here, we're going to talk about just a little bit. I'm going to show you a piece of my opening repertoire and how I understand where the pieces go and why. And you can see that it's not just about memorizing specific move orders, okay? So one of the ways that I shortcut my study time, because I have 3 kids and my business work, that keep me from studying chess a whole bunch. I do study quite a bit, but not as much as maybe I would like. I use an opening called the Kali system, and the principles can apply to a lot of different responses. So I'm just going to show you just a couple, just to show you how this works. Okay, so here I start off with d4, and this is for my white repertoire. And now my opponent can respond with d5 or knight to f6, and let's see if he plays d5. The next move here would be knight to f3 for me. Okay, and you can see how we're following these opening principles. I've developed the knight here. My opponent can play knight to f6. That's probably the most common in this position. And if I were to play something like c4, this would transpose into the queen's gambit, which is fine as well. But the Kali goes e3. And the idea here is that you can see that it does. Remember, I mentioned in the previous tip that you don't want to block your bishop necessarily, but the whole point is I understand where this bishop is going to go. And then the fact is, in some of the openings, it's going to go here to b2 or a3, and sometimes I'm going to be preparing to play this e3 to e4 so that the bishop can come out here. So that is why we play e3. And understanding that, I can play this without worrying because I know what I'm going to do with this bishop later. Okay, well, let's continue on with kind of a typical Kali opening, or a couple options here. So e6 is often played, and here I play bishop to d3. Okay, now I want to contrast that. If my opponent were to play something like c6, which can lead into variations of the Slav, I will instead play my knight to d2. And the reason for that is that with this bishop opened up, he might want to play something like g4, in which case I might, and again, I'm not saying that I always do this, but I might want to play this bishop here to e2 to relieve this pin. Whereas if I played it to d3 and then he plays g4, Then let's say I play something like h3 and he goes back, and then let's say, for example, I pushed here with g4, then he can now oppose this bishop that was developed because this is a good bishop for me, and he would be trading off his. I would say it's not. It is a bad bishop technically because these pawns cover the light squares, but he's just trading off my bishop for his. Well, you would say his bad bishop, but it is an active bishop right here. Okay, so that is one of the ideas there. Let's go back a few moves and just move along back along this line with e6. So I played here, and oftentimes he will break in the center with c5. This is the main line of the Kali, and I don't see, this is where you need to understand or see the threats. So even though we're just in the opening, there could still be some threats that would hinder development as well as maybe lose material. So you do have to be careful. His threat would be c4 here, but that is easily averted by c3. So if I were to carelessly castle instead, just go back. If I were to carelessly castle here, then he could play c4, and now I just wasted a move because I moved my piece to d3 and it has to go down to e2. Okay, but I didn't do that, so instead I would play c3 here, and let's say he develops here to knight to c6, then I can castle, and let's say he plays his bishop here. I play my knight here, and then he castles. So he's developing very nicely as well. And then here is where understanding the opening comes into play. In this particular opening, my main line here is to take here on c5, and after he takes back with the bishop, to push this e4 pawn. And what this does is now will open up after a few exchanges. After a few exchanges, and I'm just playing through these quickly here, you can see now that I can, this bishop now can develop along here. Okay, and we're going to stop along this particular line. It's not a class on the Kali, but I just want to show you how understanding the typical placements of the pieces in your opening can help you to play the opening effectively because you know what the overall strategy is. So I want to encourage you to continue studying the opening as well as your other studies, of course, because it doesn't just help you in the opening phase, but it will help you in the later phases of the game because you will understand the overall strategy of the game. And of course, we're going to touch upon some of the concepts there in other future sections of this strategy course. Okay, now in this tip, we're going to talk about what to do when you are ahead in development. So the idea is that development is what we call a temporary advantage. So you want to use that time when you have an extra piece or two out and active to seek out other types of advantages. Of course, this could be a material advantage if you could win material, but it could also mean things like improving your pawn structure or the placement of your pieces because your opponent still needs to take an extra move or two to catch up in development. Okay, because you are ahead of development, you usually want to avoid trading pieces unless, of course, it's helpful to you. The reason why is because when you have your army out, you are essentially ahead in material in a particular zone of the board. So if you trade those pieces, you're taking away from your attacking force, okay? And you're allowing your opponent to, I guess, stave off any advantage you have there. And if your development can lead to an attack on the king, for example, or some other type of attack, you might want to open the position, and that could involve advancing a pawn to open a file, or making a pawn advance to open a diagonal, for example, or maybe even a sacrifice, depending on if that type of move can lead to a bigger advantage. So let's take a look at an example. Okay, to show you the power of an advantage in development, I'm going to show you a game here between Chigorin, the great Russian master, and Byrne, who is also a master, of course. So Let's take a look here. Bern was playing black, and he is going to be our uh, teacher in this. Okay, so e4, e5, f4. This is the king's gambit. Bishop to c5, knight to f3, d6. So far, so good. C3, knight to f6, bishop to c4. And so far, everything looks pretty good as we're talking about. White has two pieces, minor pieces developed. Black has two minor pieces developed. Knight to c6. And now, right here on the sixth move, this is where black is already in, or white is already in trouble. He plays d3 here. Now, this doesn't look like it should be a huge problem, but the big issue here is that white's king is going to get stuck in the center. And we can see here that this bishop just aims right along this diagonal. So since then, and I played this opening a little with black a few years ago, white's move here is to play d4 just to block that up there. So that is the typical move, but instead here he plays d3. And I think the idea here is just to free this bishop, but he gets him into a little trouble. So let's see what black does here. He castles. Okay, again, white can't castle right now. So he plays queen to e2. He's starting to see his trouble here, trying to develop, and I think what he's doing, he's trying to get this bishop over here, but black is already gaining ground here. Rook to e8. And so here we can see that we are having some potential issues. We have a couple pawns in the way, but we will see in a second that could be troublesome. So white tries to close this off with f5, and here already black has an advantage. Okay. By the way, let me just show you here. If let's clear this. If white were to play bishop to e3, then black can break through here with d5. And I got a couple variations to show you. If he takes this bishop, which seems like a good idea because it's hanging, then we take here on c4, and then if white continues here, black would take here, and if white takes here, now the rook takes, and now we're threatening to take this pawn as well as this bishop. So if this bishop retreats, then black has a nice game here because he's attacking this queen, and this pawn is weak, and this we're going to be able to develop very nicely this bishop, and white is winning here. Let's go back to the game. Instead he plays f5. Well, here this pawn break works anyway. d5 attacking this bishop and the central pawn here. White retreats. Okay, let's see here. If he takes, then e4 comes. Okay, and just to show you what happens here, if we take, then we have the pin. Okay, so this queen is pinned, and white's going to lose material. Okay, so in the game, Chigorin played bishop to b3. And here, as I mentioned in the slide, that when you're ahead in development, sometimes if you have an attack, you can sacrifice in order to open lines. Okay, so bishop to f5, okay, takes f5. If we were to take here, then again, that e4 move, because of this lineup, is terrible. Again, if we take, then we have this pin. Okay, let's go back to the game. So instead, white plays bishop to g5, trying to counterattack, trying to catch up in development, but it is almost too late. Let's just see the rest of the game here quickly. D takes e4, d takes e4, bishop takes e4, okay, and queen to c4, trying to get out of this potential pin here. Queen to d5. By the way, well, white plays queen to b5 here, attacking this pawn. Going back, queen takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop takes f6. Then we would take here on b3. And then if the pawn takes, black takes. And we can see here, white is still ahead in development. Black can't castle this way. He's going to take a couple more moves to consolidate. And white, or black, has these nice central pawns. The fact that the king's position is a little compromised doesn't really matter because white does not have a queen on the board and does not really have any chances to attack the king. So black in this variation has has converted a lead in development into a structural lead, and in fact a slight material advantage as well. But let's just finish up the game here. Instead, white played queen to b5, but then after bishop to f2 check, then white resigned. Okay, if he takes it, then of course we just take the queen. Okay, so that bishop to f2 check was a discovered attack with the queen on the queen here. Okay, so that is how you do it, and the master shows us how it's done. Okay, let's go on to the next tip. Okay, what should you do when you're behind in development? And this is going to happen sometimes, maybe because you don't know an opening very well, or your opponent makes some moves that you're not sure of, and then you end up playing suboptimally. Well, you're going to have to play a little defensively for a little bit and seek to minimize your opponent's piece activity. And we'll look at that in an example from one of my games. You want to keep the position closed until you catch up in development. Sometimes you can't avoid it, but you don't want to open up the position where your opponent's extra piece or two in developed pieces can take advantage. And then when you get the opportunity, if your opponent is ahead in the development, trade off a piece or two to reduce that advantage in development. Okay, so let's take a look at an example game. Okay, this next position is from one of my games, and I will show you what happens. I'm not going to show the whole game, but I made a mistake here in the opening, and in this case, the move that I should have played was e6, and what that would do is would allow me to develop this bishop here to e7, and then I can get my knight out. It also covers this d5 square, which you'll see in a second is very important. Instead, I played g6 with the idea of developing my bishop here, which in and of itself is not horrible, but I did not adjust the rest of my development strategy to this, okay? So my opponent played e2, and I played bishop to g7, and my opponent played knight to f3. By the way, you may notice that this pawn is hanging, but I didn't want to get my queen trapped, so I left that alone. Might have been safe to take at some point, but learn very quickly. Often you don't, when you're developing, you don't want to try to just grab these pawns unless you're absolutely sure it's safe. Okay, I castled. So far it seems okay, and I'll show you what happens here. He castles, and now I play bishop to d7, and this is the start of my troubles here. He plays queen to d2. And his idea, as you'll see in a second, he's going to play his bishop here. And here I play knight to c6. And he plays d5, just shutting him out. I lose material if I move it here anywhere else. I could move it, well, I can't move it here safely. For example, if I move it here, he'll play b4, and then now my knight is trapped. So I have to move it back here to b8. So now this rook is stuck. I would have loved to have this rook on c8. And now this brings in some of the tips that we are talking about here. Is that now I realize I had to play defensively and really try not to push the issue too much until I can catch up in development. So let me show you what I did. And again, my opponent had to help me here by maybe not making the most optimal moves. So he plays bishop to e3, attacking my queen. I bring it back to d8. Now he plays that bishop to h6. And again, I'm trying to catch up in development. So I don't want to take this bishop because then he's bringing his queen in, and then he's going to bring this knight in at some point, and then he could bring this knight in to deflect this one, and I'm in a lot of trouble, okay, because my other knight can't come over to help, okay? So instead I play rook to e8. Okay, let me just go back one. So instead of taking, I play rook to e8 so that my bishop, I want to break out at some point so I can try to get rid of this nasty pawn or this very constricting pawn here. Okay, he takes, and I take as I anticipated. And now he plays knight to d4, activating this rook onto an active, very active square. And actually, but even though it seems active, it does give me a little room here. I play a preventative move, a6, so that he can't bring his knight here. Um, and then he plays a4, preventing me from playing b5 right away. So I play queen to a5. This was sort of a kind of a tactical move. I'm not going to win this queen here. I'm pinning this knight, but it just kind of hinders him a little bit. And also the plan will eventually to, at some point, maybe play b5. But having this queen more active was part of my idea. He plays his bishop to f3. Again, this is sort of helping me because this pawn this pawn is blocking his bishop, so he doesn't really have anything great to do there. So here I play bishop to c8. And this is, again, I can play kind of slow because he's not playing too aggressively. But again, I'm not trying to do anything active in terms of trying to push out against his position. I'm really just trying to get my pieces developed here. He plays his rook to e1, that's very reasonable. And now I get this knight out. Okay, and I had to bring that bishop back in order to do that. He attacks my queen. I did have that in mind. And so I played my queen to b4, and now my queen is active along this rank. He plays a5 to kind of shut it back out. His idea is to play his rook here, and so this is where actually kind of a tactical move. It actually took me about 40 minutes to decide on this. I played b5, which ended up being a great move. Keeps this queen or this rook out, and then if for some reason he decides to take en passant, now my knight getting active here, and then if he brings his knight in to come into here, my bishop can cover that square. So at this point, well, let's play a couple more moves just to show you what happened. Well, he plays rook to e3 instead, and now my knight gets to e5, attacking this bishop, brings his queen to e1. Reason why is because my knight here is threatening to come to c4 and fork those two pieces. And now my bishop comes out to b7. Rook to d1. I take here. My queen comes out. And now you can see that my position is pretty much equalized. And after I analyzed this game was played maybe about four or 5 months ago. My position's very even. In fact, I at one point had a slight advantage in the game. Fortunately, I did blunder later in the game and lost. But the idea here was that I kept my cool, even though my opponent had a definite advantage in development and space, and I kind of just methodically and systematically caught up in development because my opponent, I didn't allow my opponent to open up the game and take advantage of his development. Okay, just to finish off this video, I want you to consider openings that have similar piece placements and pawn structures, and not that you want to do this for the rest of your chess career, but it is a way to maybe help you to understand why pieces go in certain places and what types of strategies can flow from that, okay? And there's different books that have opening systems, full opening systems that you can study that have those similarities, and the authors design the opening repertoire that way. Okay, you want to try to coordinate your development so that your pieces don't interfere with each other. As we showed in some of the examples, you want to make sure that your pieces are working together towards a strategy. And the next one is one that I have noticed myself in studying the games. Study the games of Paul Morphy. He was an early 19th or a mid 19th century chess master, probably the best player at the time. This was before the World Championship was developed, and his games, he was a brilliant player in many areas of the game, but he is well known for his efficient development. So see how he develops his pieces. Not that you want to copy the specific moves, because opening theory has moved forward since Paul Morphy, but a lot of times if you're a beginning or intermediate player, your opponents aren't going to have a lot of opening knowledge in any case. So understanding how and why a master such as Paul Morphy develops his pieces will be a benefit to you. And I will have some links to some books that you might find helpful that have some Morphy games as well as other masters. Hey guys, I hope you enjoyed this video, and make sure that you hit the like button. Again, I am trying to gauge how much you're enjoying these videos, and those likes are one indicator, as well as your comments. Also, just make sure you subscribe to the channel so you can see the other parts of this series, and I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you soon.